This video is about the rules of the lore system, the RPG system that is used for the setting Rational Magic. In the lore system, when you want to do something and the result is in doubt, you roll 2d10 and a 1d6. The 1d6 is called a boon die. I'll get to that in a bit. The 2d10 is added up and a talent is added to it. There are 4 talents in lore system: aggress, finesse, envision, and will. Aggress is about strength, acts of athleticism, and using big weapons. Finesse is about using lighter weapons in more, finesseful ways. It's about stealth, it's about sleight of hand. Envision is about seeing things clearly, and also about wit, how fast you think, how fast you react. And will is about the force of a personality. These talents range from 1 to 6. And if you're good at doing something, what we call proficient, you add 1. So you roll 2d10, you add 1 talent, and only 1 talent, which is a number between 1 and 6, but most players will have 2 or 3, maybe 4. And plus 1 if you're good at it. This is then compared with a challenge rank, which is a target number. The default challenge ranks are 11, 15, and 19. When you're trying to do something against another character, or another character, NPC, or player is trying to do something against your character, the challenge rank is calculated differently. For that, the challenge rank is 10 plus the relevant talent number. So if I am fighting with a long sword and someone is attacking me, their difficulty, their challenge rank to hit me is 10 plus my character's aggress. If I am fighting with a rapier or a fencing weapon, I roll the 2d10 and I add my finesse, and they have to defend with 10 plus their finesse. Finesse is always used and can always be used in melee combat, representing the character's ability to generally be defensive and dodge. Aggress is used for bigger weapons, and so if you're fighting with another character using, say, halberds, and you're fighting against another character as a halberd, the attacker rolls 2d10 plus their aggress. The defender's challenge rank is 10 plus their aggress. There is advantage and disadvantage system. So if there is an advantage, the boon die, the 1d6, is added to the 2d10. If there's a disadvantage, the 1d6, the boon die, is subtracted from the 2d10. Advantage and disadvantage cancel each other out. You generally get advantages and disadvantages from situational modifiers, from special abilities, also something that's called a leverage action. So a leverage action are things that you do to prepare to make your next action more easy or make someone else's action more difficult. This includes things like aiming with a ranged weapon, or doing a fencing maneuver before you attack so that you get a better result. Speaking about results, when the roll on the dice, the final number is 4 or more greater than the challenge rank, you earn what's called a feat. A feat is a special result. In combat, feat results usually in extra damage. There is also a thing called doubles. If you roll double numbers on that 2d10 and you have an advantage, you gain a feat as well. If any of the numbers on your dice, including the boon dice, if any 2 numbers match and you have disadvantage, you get what's called double trouble, which means bad things happen. When you miss a roll, there's a failure, and the GM, in combat, and you miss, you just miss. Outside of combat, there is a mechanic called flubs. So outside of combat, when you miss a roll, when your roll doesn't make the challenge rank, the GM will have a choice to make. The GM will either tell you you missed, you failed, or the GM will say you could flub. The GM will say you flubbed that, you succeeded in what you were trying to do, but there is added risk because some guards were alerted to your presence, or because some rocks slipped on the wall that you were trying to climb, or something. Um, so when you flub, the boon die is added to what's called a risk counter, and there could be different risk counters in a game. There could be an overall risk counter for a session. It could be a risk counter for a particular scene. The risk counter goes from 1 to 20, and is usually represented on the table by a d20. So when there's a flub and the boon die is added to the risk counter, that number goes up. If the risk counter is greater than the challenge rank of the task that you're trying to do, it's called a high risk situation. And in this case, you get a disadvantage. And if you roll a dice and you have a disadvantage and you get double trouble in a high risk situation, then mayhem breaks loose. Everything happens. The alarm is sounded. You fall off the cliffside. Just generally bad things happen. To note, the GM has an option. They can tell you that you failed your roll, they can tell you that you flubbed the roll, or they can offer you a choice. The GM can say, well, if you continue to try to pickpocket your target, you will succeed, but the guards will take notice and people will come to investigate and people will become more alert. So in other words, the GM can offer it as a option for players to decide if it is worth it to increase the risk of the scene or of the session. So those are the basic dice mechanics. Real quick, talking about combat. Combat takes place in turns. It's fairly similar to traditional games. You start off by rolling initiative. Initiative works where you make an envision roll against a challenge rank of 11. Those who pass it are fast. Those who pass that test with a feat are called fastest. Those who fail it are slow, and those who fail it with double trouble are the slowest. So the order of priority goes fastest, fast, NPCs, slow, and slowest. Within each tier, players can decide on who goes first, unless the players are fighting against each other, in which case there are rules on how to resolve who goes first based on which weapon size, who has the higher envision, and also just in general what's happening in the game logic. Also, if you get the drop on someone, if you successfully were hiding, you're automatically in the fastest tier, even if you fail your envision roll. So after your initiative, combat goes in turns. When it's your turn, you have the ability to do one main action, which is either a leverage action or an attack, usually, and a free action, which includes running a certain one zone, which is a generic abstracted unit of distance, or talking, or things that don't require a roll, such as activating a spell that doesn't hurt people and has 100% chance of activating and doesn't cost any mana, like this. When you attack and you hit, the boon dice becomes a damage die. So that one roll that you did the attack, that d6 then becomes the damage die. Your weapon damage is added to it. Any armor is subtracted to it. Armor usually ranks 1 for leather armor up to magical battle armor, which would have a armor value of 4. The armor is subtracted from the damage, and then this is applied against hit points. Usually players have between 9 and 11, 12 hit points, and NPCs have somewhat less. If the hit points are reduced to 0, the character regular NPCs are just taken out, which means that the players decide what happens to them. If a player, or what's called a named NPC or an important NPC, HP goes to 0, they go into what's called a critical state. And in a critical state, players get a condition, and anytime they receive more damage, they have to make a resist roll, which in other role-playing games is called a saving throw. And that's the resist roll is usually the aggress, again, an aggress roll versus a challenge rank of 15. If you fail that, then you're taken out. I mentioned conditions. Well, a condition is a state that can apply an advantage or disadvantage onto people. When a condition is on a character, it goes onto a talent and it adds a disadvantage to using that talent. Unless the player can role play why that condition doesn't matter in that situation. So the reason why we developed in using conditions is because mind control is a big deal in this game, in the Rational Magic setting. And the way mind control works is not that players are forced to do something based on what is told to them. They can lawyer what happens to them when they're under a mind control. So if they're mind controlled to be obedient to a wizard, then anything they do against that what we call the Gia spell would inflict a disadvantage onto the talent that condition is on. However, if the player can rationalize and verbalize why what they're doing is actually in line with what the wizard wants them to do, then that they can bypass that disadvantage. So that's the basics of the mechanics. Now let's get into a core feature of the lore system, and that is the lore sheets. Now, what lore sheets are descriptive passages that have a level on it. And the level is symbolized by a box, 1, 2, 3, or 4 boxes. And so there's levels of 1, 2, and 3, and 4. When you use lore sheets in a variety of ways. One way is just by reading it, because a lore sheet usually contains information about the settings that the GM wants to give to players, or that the player had written up themselves previous to the session start, or the lore sheet contains information about the character's back history, and the lore sheet may and should contain information about the character's relationships with other characters or NPCs. So the way it's used is that when you have a lore sheet that says that you have a relationship with another character, you can tap the lore sheet in order to gain an advantage on something having to do with that other character. If it describes a situation where that other character can provide wealth or equipment, you can tap it to gain wealth or equipment. You can tap lore sheet once per level per session of that particular lore sheet. So lore sheets also provide what's called proficiency. So there's a subclass of lore sheets called profession lore sheets, and this acts very much like professions in Barbarians of Lemuria and also in 13th Age, where it says what type of work you do, and generally that describes what you're proficient in, and if you are proficient in it, you add +1 to your roll when trying to do something in line with that profession. Lore sheets can also be used to summon allies and NPCs, retainers and followers. They provide various other benefits. The lore sheet can be accepted onto a character sheet by the player, and the player has the right to reject a lore sheet at any time. So at character creation or in between sessions, when a lore sheet is offered to them, they can say, no, I don't want that. I don't want that to be part of my character's background. I don't want this part of my character's history. The players can work with the GMs to write their own lore sheets and write out their history, or even add to the settings information that's in this game world. On the other hand, the GM and also game designers or content creators can use lore sheets to make a bribe to the players and they could say, hey, you can take this lore sheet and I'll give it to you at a discount price basically players spend experience points to buy lore sheets, and when they fulfill lore sheet, they get a bonus experience point back. So the GM can give essentially free missions and free experience points by offering lore sheets to the players at a discount and say, hey, if you want this to be part of your character's background or part of your character's knowledge or part of your character's connections to the game world, then you can take a look at this and the player can accept it or reject it. That's completely up to the player. The GM can reject a player-created lore sheet under two circumstances. One, if the lore sheet goes against the settings of the game world or the story arc that a GM may have brought to the table. And also, excuse me, the GM can reject a lore sheet based on if the lore sheet interferes with another character's history and the other player does not like that interference or does not accept this relationship. So those are the rules of Rational Magic, except for the magic system, which I'll talk about in another video.